Hello everyone, we are Caleb and Ava. Today we bring you a sci-fi story, a space expedition that caused humanity, like a bird, to never soar the skies again. Let's begin. Curiosity is a luxury. Closure is the truth. When we understood this, it was already too late. Humans are the last birds that can freely fly in the galaxy, but also another bird in the galaxy that has lost its wings. At the invitation of the space agency, I had the privilege of conducting an exclusive interview with Caleb, a returnee from the Mars expedition program. Having the chance to sit down with an astronaut from the Mars expedition was undoubtedly a rare opportunity. This space event, which attracted global attention, happened 6 months ago, yet discussions around it still remain heated, even surpassing the recent worldwide bird death incidents. For the public, the fascination isn't just because this was humanity's first trip to Mars, but more importantly, the fact that this mission, originally meant for 3 astronauts, returned with only 1. Though everyone knew that high-risk space missions could result in casualties, 6 months had passed without any official explanation. The building had been sealed off, no staff came in or out during this time, and all information had been blocked. As a result, conspiracy theories and speculations spread. Some believed the astronauts had fought on Mars, causing the deaths of the other 2. Others claimed they encountered aliens. Some even asserted the Mars landing was a hoax. In today's world, the line between truth and lies has become increasingly blurred. Mysterious events always come with mysterious explanations. The more mysterious the situation, the richer people's imaginations become. And now, as a representative of the public, I finally had the chance to get to the bottom of it all. According to the arrangement, I arrived on time at the space agency's headquarters. After closing my umbrella, I quickly entered the building. It wasn't raining. However, after the recent bird death incidents, people started carrying umbrellas when they went outside. As a result, the streets were always covered in a sea of umbrellas because no one could predict when the sky would suddenly rain down a flock of dead birds. Guided by a staff member, I was led into a room where, according to their instructions, I would be interviewing Caleb. I looked around and noticed the room was bare, except for 2 chairs facing each other and a table. This design clearly resembled an interrogation room. "Could you hand over any communication devices, like your phone?" the staff member asked. "Do I need to surrender my phone for an interview?" I asked in confusion, but I still handed it over. "It's a rule. We need to ensure no information leaks before the interview is over," he explained, taking my phone and leaving the room. Well, after today, the truth will finally come out. What's the point of worrying about information leaks? I thought to myself. I sat alone in the room, noticing the black curtains blocking the few floor-to-ceiling windows. I didn't understand why they had made the room so dark and oppressive, so I quickly pulled open the curtains, expecting light to flood the room. But to my surprise, the window was covered with black tape, sealed tightly. Before I had time to think about how to conduct the interview in such a gloomy atmosphere, the door opened and someone entered. A few years ago, when I was still an intern, I had interviewed every astronaut from the Mars expedition program, so I immediately recognized the person entering as Caleb. He looked even more gaunt than before, though still fit compared to an ordinary person. But when Caleb sat down across from me, took off his sunglasses, and revealed his eyes, I saw something in his gaze that didn't match his strong physique. Nervousness, lifelessness, and suspicion, like a trapped animal. It was a stark contrast to the bright-eyed Caleb I had seen before his journey to Mars. But as an astronaut, a great explorer willing to sacrifice for the pursuit of space, he shouldn't have eyes like that. "Hello, Mr. Caleb. I'm the reporter for this exclusive interview. Over the next while, I'll be asking you a series of questions, and I hope you'll cooperate." Seeing Caleb's anxious expression, I wanted to ease his nerves by offering a handshake. Caleb reluctantly smiled and shook my hand. The coldness of his hand told me that something was wrong with him, and whatever caused this must be the key to the truth I was seeking. I withdrew my hand and reassured him, "It's okay, don't be nervous. Anyone would be suspicious of a reporter if they didn't choose to be interviewed." Sitting across from Caleb, I could tell his situation was far more complicated than I had imagined. I also noticed that Caleb kept glancing at the window, and his foot was nervously tapping up and down, even though the window had been sealed shut with tape. I stood up, walked to the window, and drew the curtains closed. When I looked back at Caleb, he seemed noticeably calmer, as if he had sighed in relief. "Is there something wrong with that window?" I asked. Caleb spoke in a calmer tone. "Thank you. I just felt that the thin window between me and the outside world was too fragile." "Sky?" At first I was puzzled, but soon a familiar term popped into my mind: space anxiety. It's a common psychological condition among astronauts. I've met people suffering from it before. They're often terrified of the endless void of space, some even too afraid to look at the sky. The causes of this condition are usually threefold: claustrophobia, lack of social interaction, and fear of mission failure. For Caleb, the sole survivor of the Mars mission, these three factors seem to apply perfectly. "Mr. Caleb, I know you spent a long time on Mars. I'd like to know what your responsibilities were during the mission," I asked, shifting the topic away from the sky. Caleb stopped tapping his foot, and after a brief silence answered, "We carried out a series of exploratory tasks on Mars. The tasks were diverse, and each person had their own area of responsibility. I was mainly tasked with surveying the geology around the landing site and assisting Ava, the other astronaut, with observing Mars' ecological environment." "I understand. It sounds simple, but the process must have been quite complicated, right?" "Yeah, Mars is nothing like Earth. The exploration we did with probes in the past had its limitations, so a lot of the experiments and investigations that were done before, I had to repeat myself, hands-on." Listening to Caleb's tone grow more natural, I was about to ask another question to get him talking. But to my surprise, Caleb kept going on his own. Halfway through the mission, I started noticing some strange things. "What kind of strange things?" "Geological anomalies," Caleb said. "In simple terms, we found geological structures that shouldn't have been there." "Like what?" "A man-made tunnel. And then we saw some weird life forms deep inside the tunnel." Caleb slowly lifted his head and added, "Intelligent life forms." At his words, I froze for a second. It took me a few seconds to process what he said. This was huge. Who would have thought the rumors about astronauts meeting aliens on Mars were actually true? Caleb looked so serious that I couldn't tell if he was joking. I managed to hold back my excitement and asked, "So, everything you experienced on Mars has something to do with Martians, right?" Caleb nodded and leaned back in his chair, looking a bit more relaxed than he had at first. "I'll tell you the whole story about how me and my two colleagues encountered Martians on Mars. This was humanity's first time on Mars, just like when we first set foot on the moon. Caleb was lucky enough to be the first person to step on Martian soil. He didn't say anything as iconic as Armstrong's, "That's one small step for man." But this was still a huge milestone in human exploration, one that would inspire future space endeavors. The landing site was chosen at the site of a massive impact crater that had formed recently, called New Era Crater. It was deeper than any canyon on Earth. If Mars' outer layer was like skin, then this crater exposed the muscle beneath. According to the original plan, Caleb was responsible for collecting soil samples around the landing site and performing on-site experiments. This newly formed crater was a huge help for his work. Along with Caleb on this Mars mission were two other astronauts, Tim, the engineer, and Ava, the life scientist. Tim was in charge of setting up and maintaining the scientific equipment, while Ava was tasked with analyzing environmental elements on Mars that could impact life, like the atmosphere, radiation, and frozen water. After Tim finished transporting most of the instruments into their makeshift space base, Caleb and Ava eagerly grabbed their tools and headed out to collect samples from the designated spots. Standing at the sample collection point, Caleb observed the surrounding terrain, waiting for the drilling machine to start collecting soil samples. The red land, covered by the orange-red Martian atmosphere, felt like a lifeless mass, and Caleb began to question the real significance of the mission to prove life ever existed on Mars. If the mission was to prove that humanity could leave Earth and yell at the vast, silent universe, in some ways, it satisfied the human need to conquer. For Caleb, the drive to explore the stars wasn't just about curiosity. It was the fundamental reason humans did science, especially space exploration. He couldn't imagine losing the ability to explore deep space. The thought of it was terrifying. The drilling machine was fully automated. The thin Martian atmosphere made the machine's usual loud noise barely audible, but even with the sound reduced, Caleb's experience allowed him to hear an unexpected noise coming from the drilling. He immediately ordered the machine to stop and withdrew. It turned out Caleb's instincts were right. The drill bit, which was designed based on previous analysis of Martian soil layers, had been worn down almost completely, with small cracks appearing. At this rate, it might break apart deep underground. Caleb was shocked to see the damage because this was a specially designed drill bit meant to handle the kinds of rock layers they expected. But the facts in front of him proved otherwise. This drill had encountered something much harder than they expected. Since the landing capsule had limited weight capacity to ensure stability during landing, they didn't bring many spare drill bits. Caleb decided to first use a probe to see what was blocking the drill before wasting more resources. The probe, attached to a cable, was lowered into the drill hole as Caleb watched the display screen. The probe's light had a cold bluish tint, but the rock walls were a warm orange-red, so the tunnel felt like an old, abandoned well on Earth. As the probe neared the bottom of the hole, Caleb furrowed his brow and leaned closer to the screen, only to discover that the drill had hit a layer of metal. The light from the probe reflected off the metal surface, standing out starkly against the surrounding rock. Goosebumps instantly covered Caleb's body, and at the same moment, his spacesuit alarmed him about his rising heart rate and blood pressure. To be honest, Caleb's biggest fear before embarking on this mission was the launch and landing. He had never worried much about the exploration itself. After all, it was just a new environment for research. But seeing the images on the screen now, his mind shifted. The primitive curiosity that humans have was now mixed with an icy sense of dread. Caleb almost slammed the screen down and leaped onto the workstation, realizing that what lay beneath his feet was something humanity had never encountered before, a man-made structure. Luckily, Caleb quickly calmed down. He called over Tim and Ava, showing them the images the probe had captured. Their reactions mirrored Caleb's, though Ava seemed more excited, being a life scientist. For her, indirect evidence of life on Mars was nothing compared to this direct, tangible proof. After analyzing the metal debris brought up by the drill, Caleb concluded that the metal plate was made of regular steel, coated with a thin layer of nickel alloy. This result made the three of them happy, but also a bit disappointed. They were excited because it confirmed that it was a man-made object. After all, there was no way natural materials could have a nickel alloy coating. But they were disappointed because they had hoped this alien artifact would be made from materials unknown to humanity, not just an ordinary metal with a known coating technique. On Tim's suggestion, the trio decided to use sonar radar to scan the area under their feet to get a clearer picture of the metal layer's size. A few minutes later, the radar-generated map appeared on the screen. The map revealed several pillar-like structures, each at a different angle. Tunnels. The word hit Caleb's mind like a bolt of lightning. To confirm his hunch, he maxed out the radar's scanning range, and the pillars quickly morphed into a vast network of interconnected tunnels, resembling an ant's nest. The three of them stared at the screen in stunned silence for a long time. Finally, it was Ava who snapped out of it first. She suggested they report their findings to Earth HQ and wait for further instructions. After several hours of anxious waiting, they finally received a response from HQ. The geological survey plan was to be changed to an underground tunnel exploration mission, and they were instructed to activate their AIT devices to ensure all data could be automatically transmitted back to Earth. The moment they were told to turn on their AIT devices, the expressions on their faces grew serious. You see, communication between Mars and Earth is delayed due to the distance. Real-time transmissions are impossible. So, at regular intervals, astronauts must manually send updates to Earth using the communication system aboard the lander. The AIT device, short for Automated Information Transmission, is a system designed to transmit all vital data back to Earth in the event of an emergency. It includes information like their location, health status, surveillance footage, and more. To put it kindly, you could call it an emergency device, but everyone knows that if anything goes wrong on Mars, help is essentially impossible. So, the device has earned the nickname the Last Words Transmitter among astronauts. When HQ told them to activate it, it was a clear signal. They needed to be prepared for anything, including the possibility that they might never return. Without hesitation, all three of them simultaneously activated their AIT devices. For them, if their small lives could contribute to advancing humanity's exploration of the universe, it would be the greatest honor. Once the new exploration plan was set, Tim, the engineer, hauled the spare drill bits to the drill site and connected them at different angles and axes. He then embedded diamond cutting blades into the drill's teeth, creating a massive multi-part drill bit. As Tim put it, "If this drill doesn't make a hole in that metal, I'll go down and dig one myself." With the drill machine now in action, the silent red soil was filled with noise once again. Because they were using multiple drill bits this time, the original hole was expanded further. Tim and Ava, without saying a word, began setting up the ropes, while Caleb stood beside the drill hole, watching it closely. He wasn't sure if what lay beneath the steel plate was the remains of Martian life, or if intelligent beings were hiding right underneath it. What would they find? Clawing aliens? Or mind-blowing alien tech? Every noise from the drill made the three of them clench their fists, even though the sounds weren't very loud on Mars. Half an hour later, the sound of rock breaking inside the hole suddenly changed to the sharp, screeching sound of metal scraping. Clearly, the drill had hit the metal layer and was fighting against it. Caleb quickly pulled up the radar again. The map showed the drill bit slowly descending. Clearly, it was making progress. Tim let out a sigh of relief upon seeing the result. At least now he didn't have to jump into the hole and start digging by hand. Not long after, the metal scraping noise faded away, leaving only the faint hum of the drill. If all went as planned, the alien tunnel should now have a sizable hole in its outer wall. After the drill retracted, Caleb eagerly placed the probe into the hole. But a rush of air from below caused the probe to wobble uncontrollably. Ava quickly aimed a gas analyzer at the hole, trying to figure out the air composition. She stared at the data in shock. The gas coming from the tunnel was a mixture of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and several rare gases. Essentially, The atmosphere inside the tunnel was identical to Earth's. After Caleb finally managed to lower the probe into the tunnel, the image it transmitted back wasn't the moment of alien contact they had been hoping for. The tunnel was pitch black, with the walls made of metal, but everything else looked just like an unfinished construction site on Earth. Ava suggested that since there were no living creatures inside the tunnel, they should go in themselves to investigate further. Caleb lit a glow stick and tossed it into the hole. The glow stick bounced and spun as it fell down the vertical tunnel, casting a ring of light against the surrounding rock walls before landing at the bottom, or what they now considered the interior of the alien tunnel. Using the glow stick as a guide, the three of them strapped into the safety ropes and began descending one by one, keeping close to the walls. Mars' gravity is about a third of Earth's, so while rappelling is less dangerous than on Earth, a fall from this height would still cause serious injury. Their eyes never left the glow stick below them. Though there didn't seem to be anything unusual in the light's range, the eerie silence made their nerves tingle. By the time their feet hit the ground, none of them dared make a sound. When they turned on their chest-mounted flashlights, the environment inside the tunnel revealed itself. Just like the probe had shown, the tunnel was entirely made of steel, and walking inside, they felt like they were in a giant sewer pipe. The only sound was the echo of their own footsteps. Ava checked the air with her gas analyzer and confirmed that the atmosphere was breathable. Tim, always the boldest, immediately took off his helmet and breathed in deeply. Seeing he was fine, Caleb and Ava followed suit, but the moment they did, a damp, unpleasant odor rushed into their noses, like the smell of an old wooden house. They cautiously moved forward, but soon found themselves faced with multiple branching paths. Which one to take? It was up to their instincts. The maze of paths made Caleb, who was leading, unsure of how far they had gone. The foul smell grew stronger, and just as he was about to suggest Tim and Ava put their helmets back on, he realized that they were no longer behind him. Caleb froze. A cold shiver ran through his bones. He wanted to scream, but before he could open his mouth, the nauseating smell overwhelmed his senses again, filling his entire nose, and then everything went black. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Caleb had no idea how long he'd been unconscious. It wasn't until Tim and Ava woke him up that he fully came to and took in his surroundings. They were in a spherical room, its metal walls similar to the tunnel they had just been in. The ceiling was covered by a mesh grate, from which strange noises occasionally echoed, likely ventilation. The room was dimly lit by a blue light strip running waist-high along the walls, and the only exit was a heavy, vault-like metal door. A simple knock made it clear just how thick it was. Whatever intelligent beings built this spherical metal room, it was clear they were as advanced as humans, if not more. As the three of them explored the room and discussed how to escape, the metal door suddenly creaked, and the thick sealed door began to open. This was it, the moment they were about to face the beings who had created this underground world. And the weight felt suffocating, like time itself was slowing down, giving them too much time to imagine the unknown. When the door finally swung open, Caleb's imagination, which had been spiraling out of control, came to a screeching halt. A pair of eyes, 2 ears, a nose, a mouth, and a symmetrical body with arms and legs. Different individuals had different hairstyles and clothing. Caleb thought he was hallucinating. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. There they were, Martian beings who looked exactly like humans. The door slid open completely, and everything, every shred of tension and doubt, seemed to freeze in that moment. The silence was first broken by the Martians. They were speaking in a language Caleb couldn't understand, occasionally glancing over at the three of them. Ao Shu Yi. The word was repeated over and over by the Martians. Caleb had no idea what it meant, but seeing their human-like faces and expressions, he could almost read their minds. It was a mix of surprise, as if seeing something new, but also tinged with pity, like looking at a newborn animal about to die. Then, it seemed as though the Martians reached a consensus. They nodded to each other, and one wearing a long robe stepped forward. He still had that same pitying look on his face. Caleb guessed this one was the leader. He gestured as he spoke rapidly, clearly explaining something. Though Caleb couldn't understand a word, the tone made it clear that the Martian wasn't hostile. In fact, he seemed to be trying to explain something. "Atai?" That was the last thing the robed Martian said. His voice went up at the end, almost like he was asking a question. The three didn't respond. After a moment, the robed Martian returned to the group, and the others slowly turned and left the room, not even bothering to close the door. The three of them stood there, eyes wide, in complete disbelief. They clearly had no idea what was going on. Was this a trap? No one knew. Caleb, still reeling from the shock, checked his AIT device to make sure it was working. The depth gauge on the screen showed that they were 12 kilometers below the Martian surface. And with all the metal around them, even if something went wrong, the AIT device wouldn't be able to transmit a signal out. After a long, tense silence, the three agreed. This was their only chance to escape. It was now or never, like a suicide squad heading out for their final mission. Nervously, they made their way out of the room, step by cautious step. Beyond the door was a long tunnel. But this time, things were different. The tunnel was lined with identical spherical rooms, and every single one had its heavy door wide open. Martians were coming and going from the rooms, walking casually through what seemed like a regular neighborhood street, like something you'd see in a small town on Earth. When a few children ran past them laughing, it hit them. This was the Martian residential area. They were underground on another planet, yet the Martians were so eerily similar to humans, living their everyday lives, that aside from the language barrier, it felt almost like they'd stepped into some underground human settlement. Even so, the three decided to keep their distance from the Martians. The last thing they wanted was to trigger a conflict by accident. Using the soundwave scanner on their spacesuits and the reflective walls of the tunnel, Tim began mapping the surrounding area. It was a bit like playing a video game where you can only see part of the map. It was tricky at first, but once they got used to it, they were able to retrace their steps back toward the tunnel they originally drilled. After nearly 3 hours of wandering, they realized the Martians were showing no interest in stopping them. In fact, each one of them gave the same curious and pitying look as the robed one, like they were watching some kind of oddity. As the lights around them started to dim and the Martians became scarcer, the tunnel grew darker and darker. They were now relying entirely on their spacesuit lights to guide them. Fortunately, the scanner showed that their destination wasn't far away. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a few shadows appeared ahead of them, blocking their path. Ava screamed in shock at the unexpected sight. In the panic, Caleb quickly recognized the figures in the shadows. It was the same group of Martians who had been whispering earlier, including the robed one. Having learned from their earlier encounter, Caleb calmly reassured Ava that as long as they didn't cause trouble, they'd be able to get back to the surface. So, they carefully tried to sidestep the Martians and continue forward, but to their horror, the Martians grabbed Tim and Ava. Caleb reacted fast, dodging their grip and immediately bolting forward, running as if his life depended on it. This situation was clearly different from before. He didn't dare look back at Tim and Ava. He could hear the sounds of the Martians chasing behind him, their footsteps growing louder, and their shouts echoing through the tunnel. Caleb didn't need to guess. He knew they were warning him to stop. But Caleb also knew that if he stopped now, he'd never get away. As he ran, Caleb started panting heavily. Realizing the air was getting thinner around him, that could only mean one thing. The exit was close. Finally, in the darkness ahead, a beam of light pierced through the tunnel. It was the hole the drill had made at the beginning, and the ropes were still dangling from the walls. Without thinking about why the Martians hadn't sealed up the hole, Caleb focused only on putting his helmet back on, grabbing the rope and using the automatic pulley to quickly ascend. He shot up through the tunnel and into the open air. Behind him, he could still hear the Martians shouting, but when he looked back, he saw that they weren't following. It was as though they were like vampires avoiding sunlight, hesitating just outside the light beam, unwilling to venture any further. A few Martians, gathering their courage, approached the entrance, and then, as if they'd lost their minds, covered their eyes and stumbled around in panic. Seeing they couldn't catch Caleb, the rest of the Martians shook their heads and retreated into the shadows of the tunnel. Their shouting slowly turned into that same phrase they had repeated over and over. Ao Shu Yi, Ao Shu Yi, Ao Shu Yi. By this point, Caleb's voice was starting to get hoarse from all the talking, so he stood up and downed the water from the table in one gulp. "So, you just escaped the tunnel and never went back?" I asked. "Yeah, I left Tim and Ava behind," Caleb said, covering his face with his hand, his tone full of regret. "From your description, it sounds like the aliens' technology wasn't all that advanced, right? Based on the way the Martians lived in the tunnels, their tech levels seemed pretty similar to ours," Caleb recalled. "Then, didn't they try to stop you when you left? I mean, if their technology is on par with ours, they should have tried to interfere with your return flight, right?" When I took off from the lander, a few glowing objects, kind of like missiles, came flying at me. But the Martians' aim wasn't great. They just skimmed past me. That was probably their last-ditch attempt to stop me. "Did you try to contact Tim and Ava before you returned?" Caleb shook his head and rubbed his face, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. "No, I tried going back to the drill hole to rescue them, but just looking at the pitch-black hole made me chicken out. I should have stayed with them. It's all my fault." At this point in the conversation, I had a pretty good grasp of everything that had happened to Caleb on Mars. His guilt over abandoning his companions was still eating at him, to the point where it had turned into a deep fear of the sky and even the universe, leaving him mentally drained. "It's not your fault. The situation back then was beyond your control. I'm sure Tim and Ava would understand. After all, you brought back the most important piece of information." "But what I brought back wasn't information. It was a cage," Caleb murmured to himself. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, confused by his words. "I know as an interview journalist, you must be focusing on my encounter with the aliens for this story." Caleb looked up. "But I need to tell you, meeting the Martians isn't the main point of this interview." "Is there something even more unbelievable than that?" "There is," Caleb said, his expression serious. "Recently we received a transmission from Mars, or rather, a video, and the source of the signal was Ava's AIT device." "They're still alive!" I was so shocked I nearly jumped out of my seat, but then quickly caught myself. "Wait, they've been living with the Martians for nearly 6 months?" Just then, the door to the room opened, and a screen was wheeled in. On it was a still image of Ava. "What is this?" "This is the video that Ava sent back from Mars," Caleb sighed. "It's because of this video that we realized humanity's first expedition was doomed from the start." Caleb pressed a button, and the image of Ava on the screen began to move. I had expected Ava to be going through some terrible ordeal with the Martians, but in fact, the Ava on screen looked almost normal, except for a deep sadness in her eyes. If you looked closely, there were other figures in the background of the video. If I wasn't mistaken, those were Martians living underground. and just like Caleb had described, they looked exactly like humans. What's more, they didn't seem to care about Ava filming the video. In fact, they acted like busy newsroom staff, casually going about their work in the background of the shot. Caleb, I think we made a terrible mistake. Ava's first words completely threw me off, but Caleb didn't offer any explanation. I'm sure you've already told others about how we found the Martians and escaped the tunnel. To the people back on Earth, that's a legendary tale. But now that I know the truth, looking back on it just feels ridiculous. I almost wish our lander had crashed when we first landed. Ava and I have been living here for 6 months, and we've more or less blended into the Martians' underground life. While we're not fluent in their language yet, we've mastered their basic grammar. Just as we suspected, they weren't hostile. The reason they stopped us in the tunnel was simply to make sure we wouldn't bring the cage back to Earth. That's all. After you escaped, Tim and I were taken back to the living area, the same place where we woke up after we passed out. The robed Martian, the one you saw before, was completely devastated by your escape. He actually yelled at us for a long time in front of us. We couldn't understand him, but based on his tone, it wasn't anything good. We thought we'd face some horrible consequences, but surprisingly, they still allowed us to move freely. The only thing was that robed Martian kept an eye on us, making sure we didn't try to escape again. To figure out what was really going on, I decided to start with the simplest form of communication. It was through this process that we learned the robed Martian's name, Yilu Iru. Iru was one of the more prominent figures among the Martians. I tried to learn their language through him, and he seemed to understand my intent. So, he started teaching us Martian. The first word he taught us was Ao Shuyi, which means cage. I thought Iru would start with basic phrases like hello, food, and goodbye, but instead, he taught us this word. It wasn't until he kept saying Ao Shuyi while pointing at himself and then at the other Martians that I understood. He was trying to tell us that the Martians living underground were living in a cage. But then, when his eyes suddenly dimmed and he slowly turned his finger to point at Tim and me, that's when I realized. He was trying to tell us that now we too were living in a cage. Tim and I had nothing to do down there. Even though they prepared our meals for us, nothing like the food on Earth, but better than the freeze-dried stuff on the ship. It gave us plenty of time to learn Martian and observe the Martians' life underground. It's worth noting that even though they lived underground, the Martians seemed to live quite comfortably. I once wondered what life would be like for humans living underground, and I guess it wouldn't be all that different from the Martians. Normal routines, normal socializing, normal procreation, just without the sky. That's it. I once asked Iru in my broken Martian why they lived underground. He just repeated the word Ao Shuyi, cage. And when I asked why they didn't let us leave, he said another word, Kola, which means protection. So, I started going through the Martians' historical records. Combining what Iru said about cages and protection, I finally understood what he meant, and also why, up until now, our surrounding planets and even our entire galaxy have been so eerily silent. Caleb, this expedition of ours, it's the farthest humanity will ever go. It's the last frontier. Long ago, so long that even the Martians have almost forgotten, the solar system wasn't as quiet as it is now. You couldn't even call it prosperous. That's an understatement. The planets were in constant communication, with tight connections between various species. Back then, the solar system was full of sounds, proof of continuous friendly exchanges between different civilizations. No matter where you were, if you looked up into deep space, the blackness between the stars would be lit up by colorful ships. It was a cosmic scene beyond human imagination, and one the Martians have long since forgotten. As for the appearance of the cage, The real cause is lost to time, and no one knows the truth anymore. There are many versions of the story in the records. Some say it was the result of a civilization accidentally bringing a huge, lifeless asteroid from its core. Others claim it happened when a civilization made a genetic error while editing a species. Regardless of how it started, I finally realized the so-called cage isn't some physical prison. It's a biological parasite, more precisely, a highly contagious parasite. Life forms infected by the parasite develop an overwhelming fear of deep space, to the point where later stage victims would go mad and rip out their own eyes. Researchers later explained that the parasite's original habitat was deep underground, in total darkness. As the most primitive form of parasite, it knew the uncertainties and dangers of the void. To it, venturing into deep space was a direct threat to its existence. So, it influences the host in various ways, from mild dizziness and vomiting to completely controlling the host's actions, ensuring they'll never look to the stars again, never have any illusions about the cosmos. The parasite spreads through contact, and its rapid spread was horrifying. At first, everyone thought the dizziness and nausea during space travel were just the usual side effects of high-speed travel. But then, several fleets transporting cargo inexplicably veered off course and crashed into the sun, and that's when the civilizations started paying attention. By then, the cage had already spread throughout the solar system. It wasn't just intelligent civilizations that were infected. The animals and plants on every planet had been contaminated too, and so the natural caves and tunnels on each planet became crowded. The major civilizations in the galaxy tried to find a cure, but once the parasite infects a host, if the host dies, the parasite dies with them. Trying to forcibly remove the parasite triggers a stress response that kills the host. So, collecting live samples or conducting experiments became impossible. The only solution was to find the parasite's point of origin. But by that point, no one had the courage to look up at the sky, let alone pilot a ship. To preserve civilization and to prevent the parasite from spreading beyond the solar system, the civilizations of the planets, Mars included, were forced to retreat underground. Meanwhile, the motionless plants on the surface slowly died off under the parasite's influence, and the animals, unable to feed under the sky, went extinct one by one. Eventually, the surface environments of each planet became as desolate as they are today. I'm sure you're reacting the same way I did. This truth is so far outside the realm of what's believable, it sounds like a made-up story. But it's real. Tim and I tried to return to the tunnel we had drilled. When I looked up, an inexplicable dizziness washed over me, and my heartbeat quickened. It felt like being someone who could never fly, standing at the edge of a cliff. But we were once people who longed for the stars. As Ava spoke, she suddenly began to cry. Caleb pressed a button, and the image of Ava froze at that moment. I didn't know how to process what I had just heard. This is the truth. Why didn't you tell us sooner? I asked instinctively, my tone filled with reproach. Maybe we could have found a cure. From the moment I successfully landed on Earth, when the hatch opened and the people waiting to greet me were carrying the parasite, it infected everyone who came into contact with them. The cage had already spread to Earth. We just didn't know it. After receiving Ava's video, based on the description, our researchers built a model for how the parasite spreads. While waiting for the results, the space agency quarantined everyone who had direct or indirect contact with me, hoping to block the transmission. But the model's predictions showed that, a month ago, the infection rate for all animals and plants on Earth had already reached 100%. The model also predicted that birds, with their weaker immune systems, would be the first to show symptoms. And just as you know, the model was right. But the fall of the birds was just the beginning. Before long, people will be like me, unable to look up at the sky. As Caleb finished speaking, a heavy thud echoed from outside the sealed window, followed by several more loud thumps. "Listen, that's the sound of the fall." I couldn't bring myself to imagine what was going on outside, especially after the recent images of countless birds falling from the sky like raindrops. I dropped the conversation notebook, feeling like it contained a curse capable of driving anyone mad. I'm just a reporter, not the bearer of bad news. I don't have the courage to tell people this. People have the right to know about the cage. Think about how deep the space agency's original curiosity about the stars ran. The pain they're going through now is just as deep, Caleb said calmly. The pressure you're carrying is probably a lot lighter than ours. After humanity crossed the unbridgeable boundary with the stars, what will future humanity live for? I asked. I don't know, Caleb replied. Like I said, I can't imagine what it would be like to lose my curiosity for deep space, and I certainly can't imagine what humanity would be like without that connection to the cosmos. I still remember the joy on that robed Martian's face when he saw us. Maybe even they didn't expect that, after the solar system fell silent for millennia, new intelligent life would emerge. Maybe, one day in the future, the solar system will give birth to a new form of intelligent life, one not affected by the cage. But by then, we might be just like the Martians, trapped in another cycle of pity. From our conversation, I could sense Caleb's obsession with the stars. In other words, his entire life had been dedicated to exploring deep space. But at that moment, I couldn't guess how Caleb was feeling. All I knew was that after telling me everything, his expression had grown eerily calm. He walked over to me, picked up the conversation notebook I had dropped, and handed it back to me. "Can I ask you a favor?" "What is it?" "Since I started experiencing dizziness and nausea, I haven't left this building. Every place I've been in has windows taped up with black tape. In other words, I haven't seen the sky in a long time. Could you help me peel off the tape and open the window so I can look at the sky?" "Are you sure you want to do that?" I asked, stunned, looking at this man with an expression of peaceful resignation. Caleb nodded. "This goes against the parasite's survival instinct, so I pretty much don't have the strength to tear off the tape." I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back. I could clearly see Caleb's hands slowly tightening into fists. As I peeled off the corner of the tape, I turned to look at Caleb again, and he gave me a firm look. I yanked the tape off and pushed open the window. Instantly, light and fresh air flooded the room. I shielded my eyes from the glaring sunlight and looked at Caleb. He had his eyes closed, arms outstretched, breathing in the fresh air deeply. I stood there quietly, watching Caleb walk to the window, but then, unexpectedly, he suddenly opened his eyes, and like a fledgling bird learning to fly, he leaped out of the window. I stood frozen for what felt like forever. When I finally came to my senses, I rushed to the window, shouting Caleb's name. At the same time, several dark shapes shot past the window, falling down, their impact hitting the window with a series of thuds. It turned out the falling sound was coming from people jumping from other floors. They spread their arms wide, no screams, their suits flapping out to the sides like wings. With each passing second, their figures grew smaller, until they became nothing more than dark spots on the paper. This was their final flight into the embrace of the sky, and they used death to demonstrate their loyalty to the stars. I don't know how many scholars jumped from the space agency building that day, but I know I managed to escape in a panic. This interview wasn't about uncovering the truth. It was about recording the final messages of a group of people who once longed for the stars more than anything. When I presented the facts to the public, I felt like I was drowning in an overwhelming sadness and solitude. It's hard to imagine that the sky we once shared for millennia would no longer be ours, no matter how many miracles Earth might hold. They could never replace the longing and hopes the unreachable stars once gave us. From that moment on, the boundary between humanity and the stars was forever out of reach. For those who had already succumbed to the infection, the truth had long since become irrelevant. They had simply gained a sense of calm after understanding the cause of their illness. They sealed all the windows in their homes, and their daily walks were always with umbrellas, heads down, eyes fixed on the ground. The only thing they dared to look at was the feet passing by, terrified of accidentally glancing at even a corner of the sky. After that, everything related to the sky was banned. Instead, exploration and construction focused on the underground spaces of Earth. As Caleb said, humanity could only follow in the footsteps of the Martians, desperately trying to preserve the seed of civilization while being locked away underground with the terrifying parasite. Curiosity about the stars became a distant, unreachable memory, replaced by the harsh reality of the parasite's prison. For a long time after the underground city was built, people lined up on the streets, heads down, filing into the underground. Compared to before, when the streets had only been covered by a sea of umbrellas, it now felt like a mass mourning ritual. It seemed fitting to mourn for themselves before entering the tomb they had dug. Attention, please. Look at the ground for your entry instructions. For those moving into the underground city, please proceed in an orderly manner based on your entry number. The cold voice of the public announcement echoed in everyone's ears as they all lowered their heads, searching for the corresponding underground city entrance, looking like a group of severely myopic people trying to find their lost glasses. After a brief period of chaos, the disoriented crowd regained their composure. With the last group entering the underground city, the last noises from the surface faded away. Only the cold wind, without the wings of birds, swept aimlessly around. The era of humanity's prison had begun, and the once loud noises that had recently emerged in the solar system returned to their eerie silence.